There was a time when England did not exist. No kings ruled from London. No single crown claimed the rolling hills, mist-covered forests, and rugged coastline stretching from the white cliffs of the south to the windswept lands beyond the Humber. Instead, scattered villages clung to the edges of old Roman roads that were slowly disappearing beneath weeds and moss. Great stone villas stood empty, their roofs collapsing under years of rain. Once busy towns echoed only with the sound of birds nesting where merchants had once bargained beneath bright awnings. For the people who lived through those uncertain years, it did not feel as though they were standing at the beginning of a nation. It felt like the end of the world they had known. And yet, hidden inside that quiet collapse was the beginning of a story that would reshape an island and, in time, influence much of the world. Welcome back, and thank you for choosing to spend part of your evening wandering through history with me. If these slow journeys into the past help you relax, consider leaving a quiet like and subscribing so we can continue exploring forgotten worlds together. If you feel like sharing, let me know where you're listening from and what time the night has reached in your part of the world. There is something comforting about imagining listeners scattered across different countries, all settling into the same story beneath different skies. Now, find a comfortable place to rest. Let the room grow still. Let your breathing become slow and steady. Tonight, we travel back more than 1,500 years, to an island where kingdoms had not yet become England, where every road carried echoes of forgotten empires, and where history was only just beginning to write one of its longest chapters. Long before England existed, the island belonged to many different peoples. Thick forests covered much of the land. Rivers wound through broad valleys, while marshes and fens created natural barriers that shaped where communities could live. Wolves still roamed the woodlands. Red deer crossed open clearings at dawn. Along the coast, fishermen watched the tides with the same careful attention their ancestors had shown for countless generations. The climate was familiar enough to anyone who has visited Britain today. Gentle rain drifted across green hills. Cool winds swept inland from the North Sea. Winters were damp rather than bitter, and summers were often mild. It was a landscape that rewarded patience more than speed. Centuries before our story truly begins, this island had attracted the attention of one of history's greatest powers. Rome. In the year 43 AD, Emperor Claudius launched a full invasion of Britain. Roman legions crossed the Channel with disciplined ranks, polished armor, heavy shields, and remarkable engineering skills. Their goal was not simply conquest. They intended to transform the island into another province of their vast empire. Roads appeared where muddy tracks had once twisted through forests. Stone bridges crossed rivers that had long divided communities. Forts rose on strategic hills, while entirely new towns emerged according to carefully planned Roman designs. Among these settlements was Londinium. It began as a modest trading town beside the River Thames. Few could have imagined that this settlement would one day become London, one of the world's greatest cities. Roman Britain was not peaceful all the time. Rebellions erupted. Tribal leaders resisted foreign rule. Perhaps the most famous was Queen Boudica, who led a fierce uprising against Rome during the 1st century. Ancient writers described burning towns, desperate battles, and enormous loss of life. Although Rome ultimately crushed the rebellion, Boudica's story endured as a symbol of resistance long after the empire itself had disappeared. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman Britain became part of an immense network stretching from North Africa to the Middle East. Merchants carried wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, fine pottery from Italy, and luxury goods from distant provinces. Soldiers stationed in Britain sometimes came from Syria, Germany, or modern-day Croatia. Latin became the language of administration, while Roman law shaped everyday life in towns. Bathhouses filled with warm steam offered comforts unfamiliar to many local Britons. Stone villas displayed colorful mosaics beneath tiled roofs. Markets bustled with traders speaking different languages. Life, however, remained very different outside the towns. Most people lived in small farming communities. They worked long days tending sheep, cattle, barley, and wheat. Seasons governed nearly everything. Planting, harvesting, lambing, and preparing for winter formed a rhythm that changed little even under Roman rule. And beneath this peaceful rhythm, another story was quietly unfolding. The Roman Empire itself was beginning to weaken. At first, few people in Britain noticed the signs. News traveled slowly. Political struggles in distant Rome felt far removed from life beside British rivers and fields. But the empire faced growing problems. Civil wars divided ambitious generals. Economic troubles strained resources. New enemies pressed against the empire's frontiers. Defending such an enormous territory became increasingly difficult. Britain, lying at the empire's edge, required thousands of soldiers simply to maintain order. Forts lined Hadrian's Wall in the north, guarding against raids from peoples beyond Roman control. Maintaining roads, supplying garrisons, and collecting taxes demanded constant effort. Eventually, Rome needed those soldiers elsewhere. During the early 5th century, imperial authorities gradually withdrew many troops from Britain. Some commanders marched south toward continental Europe. Others never returned after political struggles within the empire demanded every available soldier. For ordinary families living in Britain, this change happened slowly rather than all at once. A fort that had once housed hundreds of soldiers suddenly stood half empty. A governor stopped arriving. Taxes became uncertain. Road repairs ceased. Buildings fell into disrepair. The great machine of Roman administration simply faded. The people remaining behind faced an unsettling question. What now? There was no dramatic announcement declaring that Roman Britain had ended. No single day marked the fall. Instead, life became more uncertain year after year. Local leaders stepped forward to protect nearby communities. Former Roman officers sometimes became regional rulers. Old tribal loyalties resurfaced. Some towns survived. Others slowly emptied as families returned to farming closer to fertile land. The island fractured into many smaller worlds. Yet the greatest challenge was still waiting across the sea. Along the coastlines of what are now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands lived several Germanic peoples. Among them were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. For generations they had traded with Britain. Some had served as mercenaries in Roman armies. They understood the island better than many historians once believed. According to later traditions, British leaders invited some of these warriors to help defend against raids from northern tribes. Whether every detail of those stories is true remains uncertain. Medieval chroniclers often blended history with legend. But what seems likely is that small groups of Germanic warriors did arrive as hired defenders. Then something changed. Instead of simply protecting parts of Britain, many chose to stay. More families crossed the North Sea. Boats carried livestock, tools, children, seeds, and household belongings. These were not only armies seeking victory. They were communities searching for new homes. Slowly, settlement became migration. Migration became expansion. Expansion became conquest. The process lasted generations rather than years. Different regions experienced different outcomes. In some places newcomers and local Britons lived side by side. In others conflict drove communities apart. The old Roman towns continued to decay. New villages appeared nearby, built largely from timber instead of stone. Wooden halls replaced Roman villas as centers of political life. Pagan beliefs returned to prominence among many newcomers, while surviving Christian communities struggled to preserve their traditions. Languages also began to change. Latin gradually faded from everyday use outside the church. The speech of the Angles and Saxons spread across much of eastern and southern Britain. Over centuries, this language would slowly evolve into Old English. If someone from that age spoke to us today, we would recognize almost nothing they said. And yet, Hidden inside their unfamiliar words were the earliest ancestors of thousands of English words still spoken every day. History often remembers these centuries as a time of darkness. But that description is becoming more complicated. Modern archaeology paints a richer picture. Excavations reveal skilled metalworkers crafting elegant jewelry from gold and garnets. Fine weapons buried beside respected leaders suggest sophisticated craftsmanship rather than cultural collapse. Carefully planned settlements indicate organized communities adapting to a changing world instead of merely surviving it. The people who built this new Britain were not simply destroying Rome's legacy. They were creating something entirely different. Still, uncertainty remained everywhere. No single ruler controlled the island. Power rested in local kings whose influence could rise or disappear within a generation. Alliances shifted constantly. Marriage created friendships between kingdoms, only for rival claims to undo them a few years later. Ordinary people could never be entirely certain who would rule them next spring. A farmer clearing woodland for new fields likely cared little whether distant rulers called themselves kings, warlords, or chieftains. His greatest concern was whether crops would survive another season. A mother worried about keeping children warm through another damp winter. A blacksmith measured time through horseshoes, spearheads, and harvest tools rather than political events. Yet even these quiet lives were shaped by larger forces. Every new settlement pushed forests farther back. Every cleared field changed the landscape. Every marriage linked families from different peoples. Every marketplace blended traditions that had once belonged to separate worlds. Without realizing it, generations of ordinary people were slowly building the foundations of a future country. But the island was still far from united. Instead of one England, there would soon be many kingdoms, each ambitious, proud, and determined to shape the future in its own way. And among them, rivalries would emerge that would decide not only who ruled the land, but whether England itself could ever truly exist. For that story, however, we must continue our journey a little further, because the age of the Seven Kingdoms was about to begin, and with it came new rulers, new beliefs, and challenges that no one yet imagined would echo across the centuries. The morning mist settled gently over fields that had once belonged to forgotten Roman estates. From a distance, the countryside looked peaceful. Smoke rose from the roofs of timber halls. Farmers guided oxen through damp earth. Children chased one another along narrow paths that wound between small clusters of wooden homes. Birds sang from the edges of ancient forests that still covered much of the island. Yet beneath this quiet landscape, power was constantly shifting. No one could say with certainty where one kingdom truly ended and another began. Borders were rarely marked by walls or stone. Instead, they followed rivers, forests, marshes, and the influence of local kings whose authority could expand or disappear within a single lifetime. This was not yet England. It was a patchwork of competing realms, each with its own ambitions, traditions, and rulers. Historians later called this period the Age of the Heptarchy, the Seven Kingdoms, though in truth the number was never fixed. Smaller kingdoms appeared and vanished, absorbed by stronger neighbors or divided among ambitious heirs. Among the most powerful were Northumbria in the north, Mercia across the broad Midlands, East Anglia facing the North Sea, Essex, Sussex, Kent, and Wessex in the south and west. Each kingdom dreamed, in its own way, of becoming greater than the others. To understand why these kingdoms mattered so deeply, we have to step inside one of their great halls. Imagine entering through heavy wooden doors as evening falls. A fire burns in the center of the room, its smoke drifting upward through an opening in the roof. The smell of roasting meat mixes with wood smoke and damp wool cloaks drying after a rainy day. Shields decorated with painted designs hang from sturdy beams. Spears rest against rough timber walls polished by generations of hands. At the far end sits the king. He does not wear a glittering medieval crown as later generations would imagine. Instead, his authority comes from something less visible but far more fragile. Loyalty. Around him gather warriors who have sworn to fight beside him. They expect generosity in return. A successful king rewards bravery with land, precious jewelry, finely crafted swords, horses, and places of honor within the hall. If victories stop coming, if treasure grows scarce, if harvests fail, those loyalties may quietly disappear. Kingship in early England was never guaranteed. It had to be earned again and again. Outside the halls, ordinary life followed a slower rhythm. Most families lived from the land. They planted barley, wheat, oats, and rye. They raised pigs that wandered through oak forests searching for acorns. Sheep provided wool for clothing, while cattle represented wealth itself. A family's livestock could determine whether they survived a difficult winter. Life demanded constant labor. Spring brought planting. Summer meant repairing fences, tending crops, and gathering hay. Autumn filled barns with grain if the harvest had been kind. Winter tested everyone. Food had to last until warmer weather returned. Storms battered wooden homes. Illness spread more easily. Nights stretched long beneath dark skies. For many people, history was not something happening in distant royal courts. History arrived as a failed harvest. A new tax. A neighboring army. Or unexpected visitors carrying unfamiliar beliefs. One of the greatest changes to touch these kingdoms did not arrive with an army. It came with a monk. In the year 597, a missionary named Augustine landed in Kent. He had been sent by Pope Gregory the Great to bring Christianity to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Religion had never entirely disappeared from Britain. Small Christian communities had survived from Roman times, especially farther west. But much of the Anglo-Saxon world still followed older pagan traditions. Sacred groves stood beneath ancient trees. Stories of gods and heroes passed from one generation to another. Seasonal festivals marked the changing year. The arrival of Christianity did not erase these beliefs overnight. Instead, change came slowly. Kings often accepted the new faith first, partly from genuine conviction and partly because Christianity connected them with powerful kingdoms across Europe. Conversion also strengthened diplomacy, trade, and learning. Once a king accepted baptism, many of his followers gradually did the same. Churches appeared where pagan shrines had once stood. Monasteries grew into centers of scholarship. Monks carefully copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving not only religious writings but works of history, poetry, and classical knowledge that might otherwise have disappeared forever. And this is where the story becomes especially remarkable. While much of Europe struggled through political uncertainty after the fall of Rome, monasteries in Britain became quiet islands of learning. Inside stone buildings surrounded by peaceful fields, scribes dipped quills into ink and patiently copied words onto parchment made from animal skins. Every page demanded extraordinary care. A single mistake might require hours of correction. The work was slow. Almost meditative. Without these patient hands, much of early English history would simply have vanished. Among the greatest scholars of this age was the Venerable Bede. Living in the monastery of Jarrow during the 8th century, Bede devoted his life to study, prayer, and writing. His famous work, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, became one of our most valuable sources for understanding early England. He was not merely recording names and dates. He was trying to explain how many separate peoples were gradually becoming something larger. Something shared. Something that, centuries later, would be called England. But that future remained uncertain. Far to the north, the kingdom of Northumbria flourished for a time. Its monasteries became famous across Europe. Beautiful illuminated manuscripts, decorated with intricate patterns and brilliant colors, reflected remarkable artistic skill. Meanwhile, farther south, another kingdom quietly gathered strength. Mercia. Under powerful rulers, especially King Offa during the 8th century, Mercia became the dominant force across much of Britain. Offa was not a simple man. History often remembers him for a massive earthwork known today as Offa's Dyke, stretching for many miles along the border with Wales. Whether every section served as a military defense, a political statement, or both remains debated by historians. What is certain is that it demonstrated extraordinary organization. Thousands of workers dug deep ditches and raised towering banks of earth using little more than simple tools. Standing beside its remains today, one cannot help imagining the countless ordinary laborers whose efforts shaped the landscape more than 12 centuries ago. Offa also strengthened trade. Mercian coins circulated widely. Markets expanded. Diplomatic letters traveled between Mercia and the court of Charlemagne, the mighty ruler whose empire stretched across much of Western Europe. England's kingdoms were no longer isolated. They were becoming part of a wider European world. For a while, it seemed as though stability might finally arrive. It did not. Across the cold waters of the North Sea, another people had begun building ships unlike any Europe had seen before. Long, narrow vessels with graceful curved bows slipped easily across open seas and shallow rivers alike. Their crews navigated by stars, winds, coastlines, and remarkable experience passed through generations. These were the Norsemen. The Vikings. The first attacks were sudden. In the year 793, raiders struck the monastery at Lindisfarne. To later generations, the event became almost symbolic, the moment when the Viking Age truly announced itself. Monks who had spent their lives in peaceful prayer suddenly found themselves facing armed strangers arriving from the sea. Treasures carefully crafted over generations disappeared in hours. Sacred buildings burned. News of the attack spread rapidly across Christian Europe. People wondered whether these raids marked divine punishment, simple misfortune, or the beginning of something even larger. In truth, Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Year after year, Viking ships appeared along rivers and coastlines. Sometimes they came for silver. Sometimes for food. Sometimes for slaves. Sometimes they stayed. What made the Vikings especially difficult to resist was not merely their courage but their mobility. They struck unexpectedly. Then vanished before large armies could respond. Eventually, raiding turned into settlement. Entire Viking armies crossed the sea, bringing families, livestock, craftsmen, and ambitions far greater than simple plunder. Kingdom after kingdom struggled to resist them. Northumbria weakened. East Anglia fell. Mercia lost territory. The map of Britain began changing once again. Only one kingdom continued standing firmly against the growing storm. Wessex. Its survival owed much to one remarkable ruler. Alfred. History remembers him as Alfred the Great, but during his own lifetime greatness was far from guaranteed. When Alfred became king in 871, Wessex stood in grave danger. Viking armies had already conquered much of England. Battles came one after another. Resources dwindled. At times, defeat seemed almost certain. Then came one of the darkest moments of Alfred's life. Forced into hiding, he withdrew into the marshes of Somerset with only a small group of loyal followers. According to a famous later story, while staying in a peasant woman's home, Alfred became so distracted by planning his kingdom's survival that he allowed cakes baking by the fire to burn. Whether the story happened exactly that way hardly matters. Its endurance reveals something important. People remembered Alfred not only as a warrior. They remembered him as deeply human. A king capable of mistakes. A ruler carrying burdens heavy enough to make him forget even simple tasks. From those marshes, Alfred slowly rebuilt. Messengers traveled quietly across Wessex. Old allies answered the call. Farmers became soldiers. Local leaders gathered beneath familiar banners. Hope returned little by little. When Alfred finally confronted the Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878, the outcome changed English history. Victory did not end the Viking threat. But it preserved Wessex. That mattered enormously. Instead of endless warfare, Alfred negotiated peace. Guthrum accepted baptism. Boundaries were established between Anglo-Saxon and Viking-controlled territories. Much of eastern England became known as the Danelaw, where Scandinavian customs, laws, and language blended with local traditions. Rather than simply replacing one culture with another, England was becoming a meeting place of peoples. Old English absorbed Norse words. Place names changed. Trade expanded. Families formed across cultural lines. Even conflict, over time, created unexpected connections. Yet Alfred understood something even more important than military victory. Battles alone could not save a kingdom. Knowledge mattered too. He encouraged education, restored monasteries, translated important books into Old English, and strengthened systems of defense through fortified towns known as buzz. Stone by stone, road by road, lesson by lesson, Alfred began rebuilding not merely a kingdom, but the idea that the English people might one day stand together. Still, the greatest challenge lay ahead. The Vikings remained powerful. The kingdoms were not yet united. And among Alfred's children and grandchildren would emerge rulers whose ambitions reached beyond Wessex itself. For the first time, someone would dare to imagine not simply ruling one kingdom, but ruling all the English together. And that dream would change the island forever. The victory at Edington gave Wessex something more valuable than peace. It gave the kingdom time. Time to rebuild shattered villages. Time to strengthen old walls and raise new ones. Time for children to grow into adults without knowing only the sound of war. And perhaps most importantly, time for a new idea to take root. The people of Wessex were no longer thinking only about survival. They had begun to imagine a future. King Alfred knew that a single victory would not protect England forever. Viking armies could return with the changing tides, and the fragile peace might disappear as quickly as it had arrived. So instead of relying only on brave soldiers, Alfred invested in something much quieter. Preparation. Across his kingdom, fortified towns known as buzz were repaired or newly built. These were not simply military forts. They became places where merchants traded, craftsmen worked, and families found safety during times of danger. Roads connecting these towns were improved, allowing messengers and soldiers to travel far more quickly than before. It was a network designed not merely to defend a kingdom, but to hold it together. When Alfred died in 899, he left behind more than a crown. He left behind a stronger Wessex than the one he had inherited. Yet the work of creating England was still unfinished. His son, Edward the Elder, now faced the enormous responsibility of carrying that vision forward. Edward is sometimes overshadowed by his famous father, but history has gradually come to recognize how important his reign truly was. He inherited not a peaceful kingdom but an unfinished struggle. Viking rulers still controlled much of eastern and northern England, and every campaign carried uncertainty. Fortunately, Edward did not face those challenges alone. One of the most remarkable figures of this age was his sister, Ethelflaed, known to history as the Lady of the Mercians. History has a habit of reducing women in medieval politics to the background, but Ethelflaed refused to remain there. After the death of her husband, she became the ruler of Mercia in her own right. Chroniclers described her leading armies, overseeing the construction of fortified towns, and negotiating with neighboring rulers. She was remembered not simply as a queen or noblewoman, but as a leader. Together, brother and sister formed a partnership unlike almost any other in early medieval Europe. While Edward strengthened Wessex, Ethelflaed secured Mercia. Step by step, fortress by fortress, they pushed back Viking control. Some towns surrendered peacefully. Others resisted. Every victory added another piece to an island that had been divided for generations. For ordinary people, these changes often meant something very practical. Markets became safer. Roads could once again be traveled with greater confidence. Farmers planted crops with a little less fear that an unexpected raid would destroy an entire year's work. It was not perfect peace. But it was progress. When Ethelflaed died in 918, many in Mercia mourned deeply. Her daughter briefly succeeded her, but Edward soon brought Mercia directly under his authority. The dream of unity moved one step closer. Yet it would be Edward's son who finally accomplished what earlier kings had only imagined. His name was Athelstan. When Athelstan became king in 924, the political map of Britain was changing rapidly. Viking kingdoms had weakened. Old rivalries among the Anglo-Saxon realms had faded beneath the larger challenge of creating lasting stability. Athelstan understood that ruling Wessex alone was no longer enough. He sought to rule all the English. That ambition reached its greatest expression in 927, when Athelstan gained control of York, one of the most important Viking cities in England. For the first time, a single ruler governed nearly all the English kingdoms. Many historians therefore regard Athelstan as the first true king of England. It was a remarkable achievement. For centuries, the island had been divided among competing rulers whose ambitions rarely extended beyond their own borders. Now, although challenges remained, there was finally something that resembled a united kingdom. But unity on parchment was easier than unity in practice. Different regions retained different customs. Old loyalties remained strong. The people of Northumbria often viewed southern rulers differently from those living in Wessex. Scandinavian traditions continued throughout the Danelaw. Languages blended, laws differed, and local identities remained powerful. England had been politically united. Its people were still learning what that meant. Athelstan worked carefully to strengthen his authority. He issued law codes, encouraged trade, and welcomed scholars from across Europe to his court. Foreign rulers respected him, and his family formed marriage alliances with powerful royal houses on the continent. England was becoming part of the wider European world once again. Then came one of the defining moments of his reign. The Battle of Brunanburh. Fought in 937, its exact location remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Historians continue to debate where the battlefield truly lay, but its importance is beyond question. A grand alliance of Scottish, Viking, and Strathclyde forces challenged Athelstan's authority. If they succeeded, England might once again fracture into competing kingdoms. The battle was long and fiercely contested. Old English poetry later celebrated the victory with powerful verses describing ravens circling above the battlefield and exhausted warriors fighting from dawn until evening. Like many medieval accounts, the poem mixed history with heroic imagery, but it captured the significance people attached to the event. Athelstan prevailed. The kingdom survived. For many generations afterward, Brunanburh was remembered as the battle that protected the fragile unity of England. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. After Athelstan's death, political stability weakened once again. Several kings followed in relatively quick succession. Viking influence returned in the north, and rival claimants competed for power. Among the most famous later rulers was Edgar the Peaceful, whose reign brought a welcome period of stability during the 10th century. His coronation ceremony introduced traditions that influenced English royal ceremonies for centuries afterward. For a while, it seemed the kingdom had finally found lasting balance. It had not. Across the North Sea, Scandinavian rulers were watching England with renewed interest. Their ambitions were no longer limited to seasonal raids. They wanted the crown itself. One name in particular would come to dominate the story. Sweyn Forkbeard. And after him, his son. Knut. Unlike earlier Viking raiders, Knut did not simply conquer and depart. He became King of England in 1016 and ruled a vast North Sea empire linking England, Denmark, and Norway. History remembers him through a famous story in which he supposedly ordered the tide to stop rising. Popular legend sometimes presents this as arrogance, but the older version tells a very different tale. Knut already knew the sea would ignore him. His demonstration was meant to remind his courtiers that even kings possessed limits. No ruler, however powerful, could command nature itself. Whether every detail happened exactly that way remains uncertain. But the lesson endured. Even the greatest kings ruled only for a time. And soon, England would face the greatest succession crisis in its history. A death without a clear heir. 3 powerful rivals. An invasion unlike any before. And a single battle in the autumn of 1066 that would forever change the language, culture, government, and future of England. That, however, is where the next chapter of our journey begins. The autumn air carried a quiet chill across the English countryside in the year 1066. Farmers gathered the last of their harvest while leaves drifted gently from ancient oaks. In villages scattered across the kingdom, life still followed familiar rhythms. Bread baked in small ovens. Bells called monks to prayer. Merchants guided packhorses along muddy roads. Few ordinary people could have imagined that within a matter of weeks, the future of their country would change forever. The crisis began with the death of King Edward the Confessor. Edward left no surviving children, and with no clear heir, several powerful men believed they had a rightful claim to the English throne. Harold Godwin's son, the most influential English nobleman, was crowned king. Across the English Channel, Duke William of Normandy insisted that Edward had promised the crown to him. Far to the north, the formidable Norwegian King Harald Hardrada also prepared to press his own claim. England suddenly found itself at the center of 3 competing ambitions. For Harold Godwin's son, every decision carried enormous weight. He was not an inexperienced warrior, but no king could easily defend a kingdom against enemies arriving from different directions. He gathered his household troops and called upon local militias, men who were farmers for much of the year but soldiers when their king required them. The first invasion came from the north. Harald Hardrada landed with a powerful army, joined by Harold's own estranged brother, Tostig. The English marched astonishingly quickly, covering great distances in only a few days. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold achieved a remarkable victory. Hardrada was killed, and the Norwegian invasion collapsed. It was a triumph. But it came at a terrible cost. The English army was exhausted. Even as the celebrations faded, urgent news arrived from the south. William of Normandy had crossed the Channel. The decision seemed small at the time, but history would remember it differently. Harold turned his weary army around and marched south without allowing his men much time to recover. Speed mattered. Every day William remained unchallenged allowed him to strengthen his position. The 2 armies met near Hastings on the 14th of October. The battle lasted for hours. English housecarls, armed with heavy axes, formed a shield wall along the ridge. Norman knights attacked repeatedly, sometimes retreating, sometimes returning with renewed determination. Dust filled the air beneath thousands of marching feet. Horses struggled on uneven ground. Arrows darkened the autumn sky. By the day's end, Harold was dead. The exact manner of his death remains uncertain. The famous Bayeux tapestry appears to show an arrow striking his eye, but historians continue to debate whether this image should be taken literally. Whatever happened in those final moments, the outcome was unmistakable. William had won. History would remember him as William the Conqueror. Yet victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. Conquering a kingdom proved far easier than governing one. Many parts of England resisted Norman rule. Rebellions flared. Some towns submitted peacefully, while others fought stubbornly. William responded with determination, and at times with devastating force. During the campaign later known as the Harrying of the North, entire regions suffered destruction as William sought to prevent further resistance. For ordinary families, the change in rulers brought uncertainty rather than celebration. New lords arrived speaking Norman French. Castles rose above towns where none had existed before. Stone keeps, built to dominate the surrounding countryside, reminded everyone who now held power. The language of government changed. The language of the royal court changed. Even names began to change. Old English continued to be spoken by most ordinary people, while Norman French became the language of the nobility. Over generations, the two languages blended together. Thousands of French words entered English, creating the rich vocabulary that still shapes the language today. And beneath all of this, something much larger was taking shape. England was becoming a kingdom more tightly governed than ever before. William ordered one of the most remarkable surveys of the medieval world. Completed in 1086, the Domesday Book recorded landowners, villages, livestock, fields, mills, and resources across much of England. It was astonishingly detailed, allowing the king to understand the wealth of his new kingdom with remarkable precision. Nearly 1,000 years later, historians still rely upon its pages. Time moved forward. Norman kings were followed by Plantagenet kings. Castles expanded into mighty fortresses. Great cathedrals rose slowly above medieval towns, their stone towers requiring generations of labor to complete. Markets grew busier. Trade linked England more closely with Europe. Universities emerged, where scholars debated philosophy, law, and theology beneath vaulted ceilings. Life remained difficult for most people. The vast majority worked the land. A peasant's world was measured by planting, harvesting, repairing fences, paying rents, and surviving winter. Children learned practical skills from an early age. Illness remained common. Few traveled far from the village where they had been born. History often remembers kings. But kingdoms were built by countless ordinary hands. Then came another turning point. In 1215, King John faced growing opposition from many of his own barons. Heavy taxes, military failures, and disputes over royal authority pushed the kingdom toward crisis. At a meadow called Runnymede beside the River Thames, the king agreed to a document that later generations would know as Magna Carta. At the time, few imagined its future importance. It was intended largely as a practical agreement between a troubled king and powerful nobles. Yet its central idea, that even the king should be subject to law, echoed across centuries. The path toward constitutional government was still long and uncertain. But a seed had been planted. England continued to change. New towns appeared. Trade expanded. Ships crossed increasingly busy seas carrying wool, cloth, wine, salt, and timber. Then, in the middle of the 14th century, disaster arrived not with an army but with silence. The Black Death. No fortress could stop it. No king could command it to leave. Carried along trade routes, the plague spread across England with terrifying speed. Entire households disappeared. Villages lost much of their population. Monasteries struggled to care for the sick. Fields lay untended because there were too few workers left to harvest them. Historians estimate that perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of England's people died. The exact numbers will never be known. But the scale of loss changed society forever. Labor became more valuable. Survivors sometimes found opportunities that had previously been impossible. Old social structures weakened. Even tragedy reshaped history. As the centuries passed, England became involved in conflicts reaching far beyond its shores. The 100 Years' War tied England and France together in generations of warfare. Victories inspired confidence. Defeats brought reflection. Great commanders rose to fame, while ordinary soldiers endured cold camps, hunger, and uncertainty far from home. Eventually, another struggle emerged within England itself. The Wars of the Roses. Powerful noble families fought for control of the crown, their symbols remembered as the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York. Alliances shifted repeatedly. Battles decided kings. Kings lost battles. Once again, ordinary people often suffered most from struggles they had never chosen. By 1485, the long conflict finally reached its conclusion when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. With Henry VII began the Tudor dynasty. In many ways, medieval England had come to an end. A new age waited just beyond the horizon. Looking back across these centuries, it becomes easier to see something that those who lived through them rarely could. England was never created in a single moment. It was shaped slowly. By Roman engineers laying roads through forests. By Anglo-Saxon farmers clearing fields. By monks preserving knowledge through candlelit nights. By Viking settlers building new homes. By queens and kings making difficult choices. By craftsmen, merchants, shepherds, mothers, children, pilgrims, and travelers whose names history has forgotten but whose lives quietly transformed the land around them. The England that emerged was not perfect. It knew war and peace. Faith and doubt. Prosperity and famine. Unity and division. Yet through every generation, the story continued. Even today, traces of those centuries remain all around us. Roman walls still stand. Anglo-Saxon place names survive on maps. Norman castles overlook rivers and valleys. Medieval cathedrals continue to lift their towers toward the sky, just as they did hundreds of years ago. To walk through England today is, in many places, to walk through layers of time. Every road carries echoes of another journey. Every ruined abbey whispers of quiet prayers. Every ancient oak may have shaded travelers whose stories were never written down. Perhaps that is the most remarkable part of history. It is never only about great rulers or famous battles. It is about millions of ordinary lives, woven together across centuries, creating a future they could never fully imagine. And if you are still awake after our long journey through ancient and medieval England, I hope these distant centuries have offered you a little quiet company tonight. The roads of history never truly end, they simply disappear over the next hill, waiting for another traveler to follow them. But for now, let the echoes of old kingdoms fade into the night, let the castles grow quiet once more, and let yourself drift gently into a peaceful sleep. The original script you requested has already been completed in full, so there isn't a natural part 5 unless we're intentionally expanding it into a longer extended edition. Below is a continuation that fits seamlessly after part 3b, adding a new bedtime chapter about everyday life in medieval England. The great events of history often leave behind castles, crowns, and famous names. They fill the pages of chronicles and the halls of museums. Yet if you had wandered through England during the Middle Ages, you would probably never have met a king. You would have met a farmer. Perhaps he would already be awake before the first hint of sunrise, listening to the quiet sounds of animals stirring in their pens. The air would be cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, a rooster would announce the beginning of another day that looked very much like the one before it. For most people, history was not measured by battles. It was measured by harvests. A good harvest meant bread through the winter. A poor harvest meant worry long before the first snowfall arrived. Every season carried its own responsibilities, and every family understood that survival depended as much upon cooperation as hard work. The medieval village was a world unto itself. Small cottages with walls of woven branches coated in clay stood close together around a simple church. Their roofs were covered with straw or reeds gathered from nearby marshes. During wet weather, muddy paths connected one home to another, and after heavy rain they could become difficult to cross. Inside these homes, life was simple by modern standards. Most families lived in a single room. A fire burned in the center or against one wall, providing warmth, light, and a place to cook. Smoke drifted upward through a small opening in the roof, though much of it lingered indoors, darkening the wooden beams over many years. Furniture was scarce. A rough table. Several stools. Perhaps a wooden chest containing the family's most valuable possessions. At night, straw mattresses were spread across the floor, and blankets woven from wool helped protect against England's damp, chilly nights. Privacy, as we understand it today, hardly existed. Families lived, worked, ate, and slept together in the same shared space. Children learned by watching. A young boy followed his father into the fields, gradually understanding how deeply the seasons shaped every decision. A young girl watched her mother bake bread, spin wool, prepare vegetables, and care for younger brothers and sisters. There were no instruction books. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next through quiet observation. And beneath these ordinary routines, the rhythm of the church shaped the calendar itself. Church bells echoed across the countryside, marking the hours of prayer and gathering people together each Sunday. Festivals brought moments of celebration during long months of labor. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals, saints' days. These occasions reminded villagers that time belonged not only to nature but also to faith. Even those who could not read knew many biblical stories through stained glass windows, painted walls, traveling preachers, and songs remembered by heart. For medieval people, heaven and earth often seemed much closer together than they do today. Many believed angels watched over ordinary lives. Many feared unseen dangers. Dreams could carry meaning. Comets inspired anxiety. A poor harvest might be explained through weather, but also through spiritual concern. It was a world where faith touched nearly every part of daily existence. Yet despite the hardships, life was not without joy. Weddings filled villages with music. Harvest celebrations offered precious opportunities for dancing and storytelling. Traveling entertainers occasionally arrived with songs, jokes, and tales from distant towns that most villagers would never visit themselves. Children invented games requiring little more than sticks, stones, and imagination. Laughter, like history itself, survived every century. Food reflected the land. Bread remained the foundation of nearly every meal. Pottage, a thick stew made from grains and vegetables, simmered slowly above household fires. When available, families added onions, beans, cabbage, herbs, or bits of meat. Fresh fruit appeared only in season. Honey sweetened dishes long before sugar became common. Clean water was not always trusted, so weak ale often accompanied meals, even for children. Meat was a luxury for many ordinary families. A chicken might be more valuable alive, laying eggs, than served for dinner. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools. Old clothing became patches. Broken objects were repaired again and again until they could no longer serve any purpose. The idea of throwing useful things away would have seemed almost unimaginable. As evening approached, work slowly came to an end. The fields grew quiet. Smoke rose gently into the cooling air. Candles flickered inside cottages where families gathered around the fire. Stories filled the darkness. Some spoke of local heroes. Others remembered saints. Some told of mysterious creatures said to wander forests after sunset. Whether every tale was believed mattered less than the comfort found in telling them together. Outside, beyond the small circle of firelight, the night belonged to owls, foxes, and the whispering wind moving through ancient trees. For many people, the world ended where the village ended. Everything beyond seemed wonderfully distant. And perhaps that is one of the greatest differences between their world and ours. Today, news travels across the globe in moments. In medieval England, a traveler arriving from another county could seem almost like someone returning from another world. The pace of life was slower. The world was smaller. But human hopes remained remarkably familiar. Parents wished for healthy children. Neighbors hoped for peaceful seasons. Young people dreamed of brighter futures. Old people looked back upon lives shaped by work, friendship, sorrow, and quiet happiness. Across all the centuries that separate us from them, those simple hopes remain surprisingly unchanged. And as the village settled into silence beneath a sky filled with stars untouched by modern lights, another peaceful night began in the long story of England. Somewhere, a child drifted to sleep beside a fading fire. Somewhere else, a monk finished copying one final line onto a page of parchment before extinguishing his candle. Neither could know that, hundreds of years later, their ordinary lives would become part of the remarkable story we still remember today. Night settled gently over medieval England, wrapping villages, monasteries, and castles beneath a sky filled with stars that seemed brighter than almost anywhere in the modern world. Without electric lights to soften the darkness, the heavens stretched from one horizon to the other in remarkable clarity. The Milky Way appeared as a pale river flowing across the sky, and countless people looked upward believing that those distant lights reflected the order of God's creation. For many, the night was not a time for fear alone. It was also a time for reflection. The day's work had ended. Animals rested inside their shelters. Fires burned lower with each passing hour. The sounds that remained were small ones, the crackling of wood, the occasional bark of a distant dog, the gentle wind brushing through trees that had stood for generations before the Norman Conquest and would still be standing centuries later. Yet while villages slept, there were places where the work never truly stopped. Beyond fields and forests stood monasteries, quiet communities devoted to prayer, learning, and service. Their stone walls protected not armies but ideas. Inside them lived monks whose daily routines changed very little from one season to the next. Their lives followed the ringing of bells. Long before sunrise, they gathered for prayer by the soft glow of candles. The cold stone beneath their feet reminded them of the simplicity they had chosen. After prayer came study, manual labor, and more prayer. Gardens were tended carefully. Bread was baked. Beer was brewed. Herbs were cultivated for medicine. Every hour had its purpose. Among their most remarkable responsibilities was preserving knowledge. Imagine entering a monastery's scriptorium. It is a quiet room, warmed only slightly against the chill outside. Sunlight filters through narrow windows during the day, while candles provide enough light to continue working after dusk. At wooden desks sit patient scribes, each carefully copying books one letter at a time. There are no printing presses. Every page is created by hand. A single Bible might require months, even years, to complete. Mistakes are corrected with extraordinary care. Decorative letters bloom into beautiful works of art filled with bright colors, vines, birds, and intricate patterns. Gold leaf catches the candlelight, making the pages seem almost alive. Without these quiet workers, much of ancient history might simply have disappeared. Greek philosophy. Roman literature. Biblical texts. Chronicles describing kings, battles, famines, eclipses, and unusual weather. All survived because generation after generation believed that knowledge was worth preserving. And this is where the story becomes quietly extraordinary. The monks copying these manuscripts rarely imagined that people living 1,000 years later would still read their words. They were not trying to become famous. They simply believed that careful work mattered. History often depends upon such humble acts. Outside the monasteries, medieval towns slowly continued to grow. Many were protected by walls built from stone or sturdy timber. Gates closed after sunset, and travelers arriving too late often had to wait until morning before entering. Inside the walls, streets were narrow and busy. Workshops stood beside homes. The air carried many different scents at once: fresh bread, wood shavings, leather, smoke, herbs, and sometimes less pleasant smells that came from crowded living conditions. Craftsmen devoted years to learning their trades. A blacksmith shaped glowing iron into horseshoes, tools, and nails. A carpenter built wagons, doors, furniture, and roof beams. A mason carefully placed stones that would support churches and castles for centuries. An apprentice might spend 7 years learning before becoming a skilled craftsman himself. Patience was part of mastery. Nothing worthwhile happened quickly. That lesson appeared everywhere in medieval England. Cathedrals rose slowly above towns, but no single builder expected to see them finished. A young mason might begin laying foundations knowing that his grandchildren would still be working on the same building. Their reward was not seeing the completed masterpiece. It was knowing they had added one small piece to something that would outlast them. Perhaps there is something deeply comforting about that idea. Modern life often asks us to hurry. The medieval world reminds us that some achievements unfold across generations. As the centuries passed, England became increasingly connected with the wider world. Merchants sailed across the English Channel carrying wool, England's greatest export. Ships returned with fine cloth, wine, spices, and ideas from distant lands. Pilgrims traveled long roads to holy shrines, meeting strangers whose accents, customs, and stories broadened their understanding of the world. Although many people never journeyed far from home, England itself was never truly isolated. It listened. It traded. It learned. It changed. Even so, uncertainty remained a constant companion. Storms destroyed harvests. Illness arrived without warning. Kings died unexpectedly. Children did not always reach adulthood. Life's fragility encouraged many people to value simple moments that today might pass unnoticed. The warmth of fresh bread. The laughter of neighbors. The return of spring after a difficult winter. The sound of church bells drifting across green fields. History sometimes focuses so closely on dramatic events that it forgets these quieter experiences. Yet they formed the greater part of most lives. As our long journey through ancient and medieval England finally draws toward its end, it becomes clear that the making of England was never the work of one king, one battle, or one remarkable year. It was shaped by countless generations. Roman engineers who laid straight roads across rolling hills. Anglo-Saxon settlers who built new villages from timber and hope. Christian monks who guarded learning through uncertain centuries. Viking families who crossed stormy seas searching for opportunity. Norman builders who raised castles from stone. Farmers whose names were never written into chronicles but whose labor fed every kingdom that followed. Each generation inherited an unfinished story. Each added another chapter. And then quietly passed it onward. If we listen carefully, those centuries still speak. They echo through the ruins of abbeys where ivy now climbs weathered walls. They linger in ancient churches whose bells continue to ring across familiar valleys. They remain hidden beneath modern streets that still follow the paths first laid by Roman surveyors nearly 2,000 years ago. History is never completely gone. It simply becomes quieter. And perhaps that is why these stories continue to comfort us. They remind us that even in uncertain times, people continued planting fields, raising children, building homes, sharing meals, telling stories, and hoping that tomorrow would be a little kinder than yesterday. Across 1,500 years, those hopes have changed very little. So as the night grows deeper, and the old kingdoms fade gently back into memory, allow the voices of the past to grow soft once more. Let the castles become silent. Let the monastery candles burn low. Let the village fires settle into glowing embers beneath the cool English sky. Thank you for joining me on this long walk through the making of England. I hope these ancient roads, quiet rivers, forgotten kings, and ordinary lives have kept you peaceful company for a little while. There will always be another forgotten empire, another distant kingdom, another remarkable story waiting somewhere beyond the next horizon. But for tonight, let history rest. And perhaps, as England itself has done so many times across the centuries, you can simply close your eyes, breathe slowly, and welcome the quiet.